the room that never sleeps. Rachel was exhausted. She'd been driving for hours, the endless stretch of highway in front of her offering no relief. Her mind had begun to wander, and the blinding headlights from passing cars blurred into streaks as she squinted through the windshield. The dust storm that had rolled in earlier made everything seem surreal, like a faded dream she couldn't escape. When she spotted the sign for Rest Haven Motel, it felt almost like fate. The neon letters flickered, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked pavement, and the air was thick with humidity from the desert heat. The wind had picked up, biting at her skin as she quickly parked the car. She needed sleep, and this place, old as it looked, would do just fine. The lobby was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a desk piled with dusty magazines. The motel owner, an elderly man with grey hair and a thick wrinkled face, greeted her with a stiff nod. His voice was raspy, as though he had long since forgotten the sound of normal speech. He handed her a tarnished brass key with the number 13 scratched into the tag. The hallway leading to the room was long and narrow. The walls were lined with old portraits of sombre-looking people, none of whom Rachel recognized. The floor creaked under her feet as she made her way to room 13, the door hanging slightly off its hinges, as if it had been used far too many times. Inside, the room was cold and smelled of mildew. The bed, sagging in the middle, was covered with an old, faded quilt that had seen better days. The silence was almost oppressive as Rachel tried to settle in. She lay in bed, trying to ignore the low hum that seemed to emanate from the walls. Then the whispers began. At first they were faint, like the sound of a conversation too far away to hear clearly. But as the seconds stretched on, the voices grew louder, hissing, rasping, almost like someone was calling her name, but she couldn't quite make out the words. She sat up in bed, her pulse quickening, but there was no one in the room. The whispers turned to guttural growls, and something unseen moved just behind her, brushing the hair on her neck. A chill crawled across her skin, and she instinctively grabbed for the door, only to find it locked from the outside. The darkness around her deepened as she tried to leave, but she found herself walking back into room 13. The same dim light illuminated the bed, the same oppressive silence filled the air. And then, in the corner of the room, a dark shape began to form, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes, standing perfectly still. "You shouldn't have stayed." Rachel tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow seemed to stretch toward her, and the walls closed in. The next morning, a cleaning service entered the room to find it completely empty. There was no sign of Rachel. But on the bathroom mirror, fogged over from the cold night air, one word was written: next. The last guest at Redwood Motel. James and Claire had been on the road for hours when the engine of their old sedan sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once and then went dark. Stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but desolate fields around them, they saw a small, lonely motel at the end of a winding dirt road. The Redwood Motel. The sign hung crookedly above the entrance, the words barely visible in the dying light of the day. The inside of the motel smelled of stale air and something rotting, as though it had been closed for years. A soft creaking sound echoed from somewhere deep within the building. Behind the counter stood a thin man with unblinking eyes and a slow, deliberate smile. His clothes were old-fashioned, and his skin had a sickly pallor, as though he hadn't seen the sun in decades. Motel owner. "We don't get many visitors here. You'll be the last guests of the night." James hesitated, but ultimately took the key to room 7, noticing the strange way the man's fingers lingered on the brass key. The room was small and dimly lit, with thick curtains that kept the moonlight at bay. A floral-patterned carpet covered the floor, but it looked worn and stained in places. The bed, though made up, had a faintly unpleasant odour to it, like old wood mixed with something metallic. As night fell and the winds outside picked up, the couple settled into bed. Claire quickly fell asleep, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The motel was eerily quiet, and the walls seemed to breathe. He lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the cracked ceiling, when suddenly he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the door, slow, dragging steps that seemed to be coming closer. He opened the door, but the hallway was completely empty. The stillness was unnerving, but as he closed the door, he heard it again, this time from within the room. He turned to find Claire sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth moved, but the voice that came out was not hers. "Claire, you're the last guest to leave!" James gasped, backing away in terror as the room grew colder. Shadows seemed to crawl across the walls and the bed began to shake. Claire's face twisted into a grim smile as her body stiffened, her skin turning pale and lifeless. The floorboards creaked loudly beneath them, and the once still air began to churn with an ominous energy. Suddenly the door burst open and the motel owner stood in the doorway, grinning from ear to ear. His eyes glinted with malice as he spoke again. "Motel owner, you're not leaving, James." In the blink of an eye, the room seemed to stretch and bend, twisting in unnatural angles. The walls were closing in, and the ceiling seemed to drop lower with every breath. The floor gave way beneath them, and James fell into an endless void of darkness. The next morning, the Redwood Motel sat quiet, deserted, except for the rotting name tags hanging on the room doors and the faint scent of death that lingered in the air. The Motel of Forgotten Names. Lena's car sputtered to a stop in the middle of the highway. The engine had given out, and she had no choice but to pull over to the nearest place she could find, a small remote motel called The Quiet Rest. The neon sign flickered as she parked, the soft hum of electricity the only sound for miles. The interior of the motel was as desolate as the outside. The lobby was dimly lit with faded curtains that blocked any view of the outside world. The woman behind the counter was gaunt, her face pale and expressionless. She handed Lena a key, saying nothing, only gesturing toward room 4. The room was small and cramped, but it was clean enough. The bed was neatly made, though the walls had an odd, sterile quality to them. As Lena unpacked, she noticed something strange. Scrawled on the wall beside the bed in what looked like chalk were names, dozens of them, written hastily in uneven handwriting. Some names were crossed out, others partially erased. The longer she stared at them, the more she felt an oppressive weight in the air, like the walls were closing in on her. Curiosity got the better of her, and she began to trace her finger over the names. When her finger lingered on one, the name seemed to darken, as if the chalk were alive. A sudden gust of cold air filled the room, and a whisper, soft, urgent, sounded in her ear. "Don't stay." Lena turned to see the door creaking open by itself. She quickly closed it, but when she looked back at the wall, her own name had appeared among the others. It wasn't written in chalk like the others. It was written in something darker, like blood. She tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The name on the wall now read, "You are next." The shadows in the room began to stir, rising from the corners like dark tendrils. They wrapped around her, choking the air out of her lungs as she struggled to breathe. The room started to distort, the walls bending and pulsating as though alive. The names on the wall began to writhe, growing longer, deeper, more grotesque, until they formed one final message. "All who come here, stay forever." Lena screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her name freshly crossed out. The next morning, the Quiet Rest Motel sat silent, its doors locked, the lobby empty. But in room 4, the walls were filled with names, and one more had been added to the list. Subscribe to Terror Tales. Like and share our channel. Thank you for watching.